Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen stood at the back of the war room, her shoulders squared, but her heart heavy with the weight of being invisible. For 3 years, she had served on the USS Valiant, analyzing intelligence patterns that others dismissed as noise, writing reports that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, speaking up in meetings only to watch eyes glaze over and conversations shift away. She had grown used to the silence that followed her words, the way senior officers looked past her as if she were part of the furniture. Tonight was no different, or so she thought, as the emergency briefing began at 11:32 p.m., with an urgency that made the fluorescent lights seem harsher than usual. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The war room buzzed with tension as Admiral Richard Hawthorne entered, his weathered face, grave beneath steel-gray hair that had seen 3 decades of service. Behind him, holographic displays flickered to life, showing satellite imagery of the Malacca Strait, where 3 cargo vessels had gone dark within the past 4 hours. Captain Morrison was already speaking, his voice booming with the confidence of someone who had never been ignored, explaining how this was likely a technical malfunction or perhaps pirates using rudimentary jamming equipment. The other commanders nodded, murmuring agreement, ready to dispatch a routine patrol vessel. Sarah's fingers tightened around the tablet in her hands, her analysis glowing on the screen, showing something far more sinister. "It's not pirates," she said, her voice barely rising above the ambient hum of computers. No one turned. Commander Walsh continued talking about fuel logistics. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes checked his watch. Sarah felt the familiar burn of frustration in her chest, that acidic mixture of anger and resignation that had become her constant companion. She had spent 16 hours analyzing signal patterns, cross-referencing satellite thermal imaging, tracking radio frequency signatures that painted a picture completely different from the comfortable narrative her superiors wanted to believe. But who was she to challenge men with ribbons covering their chests and decades of field experience? Admiral Hawthorne had been silent, standing with his arms crossed, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room. Sarah didn't know much about him except his reputation as a strategist who had outmaneuvered enemy fleets in the Taiwan Strait crisis 5 years ago, and that he had an uncanny ability to see patterns where others saw chaos. He was listening to Captain Morrison describe the proposed response plan when something changed in his posture. His head tilted slightly, and then he did something Sarah had never seen in all her time in the Navy. He turned his full attention to the back of the room directly at her and spoke a single word that made every conversation stop dead. Sparrow. The room fell silent. Sparrow was Sarah's call sign from flight school, earned not because she piloted jets, but because her instructor said she saw the battlefield like a bird, taking in the whole picture from above while everyone else was stuck in the weeds. She had been an intelligence officer candidate then, top of her class, before 3 years of being systematically overlooked had dulled the shine on her career. No one in this room should have known that call sign. No one here had ever cared, enough to look at her file beyond her current rank and posting. But the Admiral knew, and when he spoke it, the word carried the weight of an order. "Sparrow, what am I missing?" Admiral Hawthorne's voice cut through the stunned silence. Sarah's mouth went dry. Every eye in the room turned to her, some curious, most resentful that the Admiral was wasting time on the junior officer who couldn't even get people to listen during regular briefings. Captain Morrison's jaw tightened with visible irritation. But the Admiral was waiting, and unlike everyone else who had ever asked her opinion, he looked like he actually wanted the answer. Sarah stepped forward, her legs steadier than she expected, and activated her tablet's connection to the main display. "Sir, these aren't pirates. The signal disruption pattern matches sophisticated military-grade electronic warfare, specifically the type developed by the Jung Collective." She pulled up her analysis, overlaying thermal signatures with radio frequency data. 3 vessels went dark, but look at the timing, 4 minutes apart precisely. That's coordinated. And here, thermal imaging shows increased heat signatures consistent with ships running combat systems, not merchant vessels. Someone wanted us to think this was random, but they're staging an ambush for whatever response we send into that strait. The room erupted in objections. Commander Walsh called it speculation. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes said she was seeing ghosts. Captain Morrison's face reddened as he argued that the Jung Collective had no reason to provoke an international incident. But Admiral Hawthorne raised one hand, and the chaos ceased as if he had cut power to the room itself. He studied the display for 30 seconds that felt like hours, his eyes moving across the data with the focus of a hunter tracking prey. "The thermal signatures," he said quietly. "Show me the adjacent grid sectors." Sarah's fingers flew across her tablet, expanding the map. 3 more vessels appeared on screen, their positions forming a perfect triangle around the strait's choke point, all showing the same elevated thermal readings. The Admiral's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, recognition mixed with what might have been approval. He turned to face Captain Morrison, whose confident posture had begun to crumble. "If we send a standard patrol vessel into that strait, what happens, Captain?" the Admiral asked. Morrison swallowed hard. "They'd be in weapons range of at least 6 hostile ships simultaneously, and we'd lose good sailors to an enemy we didn't even know was there." Admiral Hawthorne turned back to Sarah. "What do you recommend, Lieutenant?" "Commander?" The question hung in the air like a challenge and an invitation. Sarah felt 3 years of silence pushing at her back, urging her to speak carefully, to defer, to suggest only what others might already be thinking. But the Admiral had called her Sparrow, had asked what he was missing, and now he wanted her. Recommendation, as if her rank and experience mattered exactly as much as anyone else's in this room. She made her choice in the space between heartbeats. We make them think we're taking the bait. Send the patrol vessel, but keep it just outside weapons range. Meanwhile, we reposition the USS Valiant and the destroyer squadron from the exercise 70 miles east. They're running silent anyway. The collective won't see them coming. When the collective reveals their position by targeting our patrol vessel, we have them in a 3-way crossfire. We turn their ambush into ours." Commander Walsh started to object, but Admiral Hawthorne was already moving to the communications console. "Make it happen. I want the Valiant's captain on secure comms in 2 minutes. Lieutenant Commander Chen, you're coordinating intelligence for this operation. I want real-time analysis on my screen every 30 seconds. He paused, turning back, to face the room full of senior officers who suddenly looked much less certain of themselves. And from now on, when Sparrow speaks, everyone in this room listens. That's an order. At 1:47 a.m., the operation unfolded exactly as Sarah had predicted. The collective's ships powered weapon systems the moment the patrol vessel approached, not knowing they had just painted themselves as targets. The Valiant's missiles were already in flight before the enemy realized their mistake. There were no casualties on the American side. By 3:15 a.m., 6 collective vessels were surrendering, their ambush shattered by the intelligence work of an officer everyone had ignored. Sarah stood in the war room as the all-clear came through, her hands no longer shaking, her voice no longer uncertain. Admiral Hawthorne approached, his weathered face showing the ghost of a smile. "I knew your father," he said quietly. "Commander James Chen. He had the same gift for seeing what others missed. He told me about you before he died, said I should watch for a sparrow who might one day change everything." He extended his hand. "Thank you for proving him right." As they shook hands, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, not vindication exactly, but something more profound. The weight of 3 years of silence lifted, replaced by the knowledge that she had found her voice, not by speaking louder, but by being undeniably right when it mattered most. Around her, officers who had looked past her for years now watched, with new eyes, seeing not the junior officer they had dismissed, but the strategist who had saved lives tonight. Captain Morrison approached, his earlier irritation replaced by grudging respect, and offered a simple nod of acknowledgement. The war room slowly emptied as the crisis passed, but Sarah remained at her station, already analyzing new intelligence. patterns looking for the next threat others might miss. She was no longer invisible. The Admiral had spoken her call sign, and everything had changed.